When Detective Sarah Martinez volunteered for the undercover drug operation, she told her partner she had a bad feeling about it. "Promise me something," she said. "If I don't come back, don't let them close this case." Now, 11 years after her disappearance, Detective Mike Chen is about to understand why she was so afraid and why someone wanted her silenced forever. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe and like the video for more stories like this. Detective Mike Chen sat at his cluttered desk in the precinct, surrounded by towers of case files that seemed to multiply every day. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with their familiar hum, casting a harsh glow over the cramped detective bureau. Outside, the October rain pelted against the windows, creating rivulets that distorted the city lights. Beyond, it was nearly midnight, and the building was mostly empty, except for the skeleton crew working the night shift. Mike rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at the calendar hanging on the wall. October 15th, 2024. 11 years to the day since Sarah Martinez had walked out of this very building and never returned. 11 years since his partner, his friend, had vanished into the night during what should have been a routine undercover operation. The anniversary always hit him hard, but this year felt different. Maybe it was because he was finally thinking about retirement. Or maybe it was the recurring nightmares that had been plaguing him for weeks, Sarah's voice echoing in his memory. "Promise me something, Mike. If I don't come back, don't let them close this case." He had kept that promise, but barely. The case had officially gone cold after 2 years, relegated to the growing pile of unsolved disappearances that haunted every police department. But Mike had never stopped looking, never stopped asking questions, even when his superiors told him to let it go. Tonight, however, something was different. Earlier that evening, he had received an unexpected phone call from Mrs. Henderson, the elderly landlady who had owned Sarah's apartment building. She was finally selling the property and needed to clear out the remaining belongings from apartment 4B, Sarah's old place. "I know it's been years, Detective Chen," Mrs. Henderson had said in her wavering voice, "but I could never bring myself to throw away her things. I kept thinking she might come back, but now, well, I'm getting too old to hold on to false hope. Could you come by tomorrow and take whatever you think is important?" Mike had agreed, though he wasn't sure what he expected to find. The apartment had been thoroughly searched multiple times in the months following Sarah's disappearance. If there had been any clues, surely they would have been discovered by now. But as he sat there in the empty precinct, something nagged at him, a memory from their last conversation, just 3 days before she vanished. They had been sitting in this same office, sharing Chinese takeout and going over the details of the undercover operation she was about to undertake. Sarah had been unusually quiet that night, picking at her lo mein without her usual appetite. She kept glancing around the office as if she expected someone to be listening, even though they were alone. "You know, Mike," she had said suddenly, setting down her chopsticks, "I've been thinking about that Moretti case from last year." Mike remembered being confused by the non sequitur. The Moretti case had been a drug trafficking investigation that had ended abruptly when their main suspect, Vincent Moretti, had been found dead in his cell before trial. Apparent suicide, though Sarah had always been skeptical of that conclusion. "What about it?" he had asked. Sarah had hesitated, then shook her head. "Probably nothing, just patterns, you know. Sometimes I feel like we're missing the bigger picture." That conversation had bothered Mike for years. Sarah was one of the most intuitive detectives he had ever worked with. If she sensed patterns, there were usually patterns to be found. But he had been so focused on the immediate details of her undercover assignment that he hadn't pressed her for more information. Now, sitting in the quiet precinct with only the rain for company, Mike made a decision. He wouldn't wait until tomorrow to visit Sarah's apartment. Mrs. Henderson had given him the key, and there was no point in putting off what he had been avoiding for 11 years. The drive to Sarah's old neighborhood took him through the heart of the city, past the warehouse district, where she had last been seen. Even after all these years, Mike couldn't drive through that area without feeling a chill. The operation had been targeting a mid-level drug dealer named Carlos Ramirez, who was suspected of being part of a larger trafficking network. Sarah had been posing as a buyer, arranging to purchase a significant quantity of cocaine. The plan had been simple. Sarah would meet Ramirez at a predetermined location, make the buy while wearing a wire, and signal for backup when she had enough evidence for an arrest. But when the surveillance team lost contact with her wire, they had moved in to find the meeting location empty except for Sarah's purse and service weapon, left behind on a concrete floor. There had been no signs of struggle, no blood, no witnesses. It was as if Sarah Martinez had simply vanished into thin air. Mike pulled up outside the old brick apartment building where Sarah had lived. The neighborhood had changed over the years, with several of the older buildings being renovated or torn down for new development. But Sarah's building remained much the same. A modest 4-story structure with narrow windows and a fire escape that zigzagged up the front facade. Mrs. Henderson met him at the entrance, moving slowly but with determination despite her advancing age. She wore a thick cardigan and carried a large ring of keys that jangled with every step. "I'm sorry to call you so late," she said, as they climbed the stairs to the 4th floor. "But I couldn't sleep, knowing that everything was just sitting there." Sarah was such a lovely girl. Always polite, always paid her rent on time. "I keep thinking she's going to walk through that door one day and ask why I changed the locks." Mike nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The hallway smelled of old wood and decades of cooking odors, familiar scents that brought back memories of the few times he had visited Sarah here. She had been intensely private about her personal life, rarely inviting colleagues to her home. "Here we are," Mrs. Henderson said, stopping in front of apartment 4B. She fumbled with the keys for a moment before finding the right one. "I haven't been inside for years, just couldn't bring myself to do it." The door swung open to reveal a modest 1-bedroom apartment frozen in time. Sarah's furniture was still arranged exactly as she had left it. A small sofa facing a television that was now obsolete, a dining table with 2 chairs, bookshelves lined with crime novels and police procedural manuals. A layer of dust covered everything, but otherwise the apartment looked as if Sarah might return at any moment. "Take whatever you think is important," Mrs. Henderson said softly. "I'll leave you to it. Just pull the door closed when you're finished. It locks automatically." Mike thanked her and stepped into the apartment alone. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the distant sound of traffic from the street below. He stood in the doorway, for a long moment, feeling like an intruder in Sarah's private space. He began methodically searching through her belongings, though he wasn't sure what he was looking for. The bedroom contained the usual personal items: clothes, jewelry, photographs of family and friends. The bathroom held toiletries that had long since expired. The kitchen was sparse, reflecting Sarah's preference for takeout and simple meals. It was in the living room that Mike found the first hint that something was different. Behind Sarah's desk, tucked between 2 heavy law enforcement textbooks, was a manila folder that he didn't remember from the previous searches. Inside were photocopies of case files, not just recent cases, but files going back several years. As Mike spread the papers across Sarah's dining table, a pattern began to emerge. All of the cases involved drug trafficking, but not the typical street-level dealing that made up most of their caseload. These were larger operations, cases that had been closed under suspicious circumstances, or had ended with key witnesses disappearing or dying. The Moretti case was there, along with detailed notes in Sarah's handwriting. She had documented inconsistencies in the evidence, witness statements that didn't align, and what appeared to be a timeline of events that suggested Vincent Moretti's death had been anything but suicide. But it was the next file that made Mike's blood run cold. Sarah had been tracking a series of cases involving a detective lieutenant named Robert Castellano. Cases where evidence had mysteriously disappeared, where suspects had been released on technicalities, where investigations had been shut down, just as they were making progress. Castellano had been Mike's supervisor at the time of Sarah's disappearance. Mike sat down heavily in one of Sarah's dining chairs, his mind racing. If Sarah had suspected corruption within the department, it would explain her paranoia in those final weeks. It would explain why she had been so careful about who she talked. 2. Why she had hidden these files away. But there was more. At the bottom of the folder was a handwritten note from Sarah, dated just 2 days before her disappearance. Mike, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me. I've been investigating a connection between several closed cases, and I think I've found something big. There's a network operating within the department. Cops who are protecting drug operations in exchange for payment. Castellano is involved, but I think he's just one piece of a larger puzzle. The undercover operation tomorrow night isn't what it seems. I think they're setting me up. I've hidden more evidence in the apartment. Check under the loose floorboard near the bedroom window. Trust no one in the department except yourself. As Mike stared at the note for a long time, Sarah's familiar handwriting blurring as tears filled his eyes. She had known. Somehow she had figured out that the undercover operation was a trap, but she had gone anyway. Why hadn't she come to him? Why hadn't she trusted him enough to share her suspicions? The answer came to him with a sickening realization. If there really was corruption in the department, Sarah wouldn't have known who she could trust. Even Mike, her own partner, might have been compromised in her mind. She had been trying to protect him by keeping him in the dark. With shaking hands, Mike folded the note and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he made his way to Sarah's bedroom, running his hands along the wooden floorboards near the window until he found one that gave slightly under pressure. Using his pocket knife, he pried up the board to reveal a hidden space beneath. Inside was a small waterproof box containing a digital camera, several USB drives, and another folder of documents. Mike's heart pounded as he realized what Sarah had left for him. Evidence that she had been gathering for months, possibly years. The photographs on the camera showed clandestine meetings between police officers and known criminals. The USB drives contained recorded conversations, surveillance footage, and detailed financial records showing payoffs and bribes. The documents included bank statements, phone records, and a complex organizational chart that mapped out what appeared to be an extensive corruption network. At the center of it all was Detective Lieutenant Robert Castellano. But he wasn't alone. Sarah had identified at least a dozen other officers who were involved, including some whose names Mike recognized as respected members of the force. As Mike absorbed the magnitude of what Sarah had uncovered, he began to understand the true scope of the danger she had been in. This wasn't just about a few dirty cops taking bribes. This was about a systematic corruption of the justice system, with tentacles reaching into every aspect of law enforcement in the city. And now, 11 years later, Mike was the only one who knew the truth. Mike spent the rest of the night in Sarah's apartment, going through every piece of evidence she had collected. By dawn, he had a clear picture of the conspiracy that had cost his partner her life. The network Sarah had uncovered was more extensive than anything he could have imagined, involving not just police officers, but also prosecutors, judges, and city officials. The corruption had been operating for years, protecting drug trafficking operations while simultaneously prosecuting smaller competitors to maintain the illusion of effective law enforcement. Cases were manipulated, evidence was planted or destroyed, and anyone who got too close to the truth was either bought off, transferred, or eliminated. Sarah's final investigation had focused on a series of suspicious deaths and disappearances of witnesses and informants. She had documented a pattern of people dying or vanishing just before they were scheduled to testify in major drug cases. The deaths had all been ruled suicides, accidents, or attributed to gang violence, but Sarah had found connections that investigators had either missed or chosen to ignore. The undercover operation that had led to Sarah's disappearance hadn't been a routine drug buy at all. According to her notes, it had been specifically designed to eliminate her while making it look like she had been killed in the line of duty. Carlos Ramirez, the supposed drug dealer she was meant to arrest, had been working with the corrupt officers all along. Mike felt a mixture of rage and grief as he read through Sarah's carefully documented evidence. She had been so close to exposing the entire network, but she had underestimated how far they would go to protect themselves. Or perhaps she had known exactly what she was walking into and had decided that getting the evidence into the right hands was worth the risk. As the morning sun filtered through Sarah's bedroom window, Mike made a decision. He couldn't take this evidence to anyone in the current department. Too many of the people Sarah had identified were still in positions of authority. He needed to find someone outside the system, someone who could investigate without alerting the very people who had orchestrated Sarah's disappearance. Mike carefully packed all of Sarah's evidence into a large duffel bag and left the apartment. He drove across town to a small coffee shop where he had arranged to meet someone who might be able to help, Rebecca Torres, an investigative journalist who had built a reputation for exposing corruption in law enforcement. Rebecca was already waiting when Mike arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her laptop open and a stack of newspapers beside her. She was younger than Mike had expected, probably in her early 30s, with short dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. "Detective Chen?" she asked as he approached her table. Mike nodded and sat down across from her. He had contacted Rebecca through an encrypted email account, providing just enough information to pique her interest without revealing the full scope of what he had discovered. "I appreciate you meeting me," Mike said, glancing around the coffee shop to make sure they weren't being observed. "What I'm about to show you is going to change everything you think you know about law enforcement in this city." Over the next 2 hours, Mike laid out Sarah's evidence piece by piece. Rebecca listened intently, taking notes and asking pointed questions that demonstrated her understanding of how corruption networks operated. She had investigated similar cases in other cities and recognized the patterns that Sarah had identified. "This is incredible," Rebecca said finally, looking through the photographs and documents spread across their table. "Your partner documented everything: financial records, surveillance footage, recorded conversations. This is enough to bring down the entire network. The question is, how do we make sure it actually happens?" Mike asked. "Most of these people are still in positions of power. If we take this to the wrong person, the evidence could disappear and we could end up like Sarah." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "I have contacts at the FBI who specialize in police corruption cases. They have the resources and authority to investigate without interference from the local department. But we need to be careful about how we approach this. If word gets out that you've found Sarah's evidence, you could be in danger." Mike had been thinking the same thing. For 11 years, the corrupt officers had believed that Sarah's evidence had died with her. Now that he had uncovered the truth, he had become a threat to their continued operation. "There's something else," Mike said, pulling out a USB drive that contained Sarah's recorded conversations. Sarah managed to record several meetings between corrupt officers and their criminal contacts. One of those recordings is from just 3 days before she disappeared. "Lieutenant Castellano is discussing plans for the undercover operation with someone whose voice I don't recognize." Rebecca plugged the USB drive into her laptop and found the audio file. As they listened to the conversation, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Castellano's voice was unmistakable. "Martinez is getting too close. She's been asking questions about the Moretti case, and I think she's starting to connect the dots. We need to handle this before she figures out the whole operation." The other voice, distorted by the recording quality but still audible, responded, "The undercover op is perfect cover. Make it look like she got in over her head. Got herself killed trying to be a hero. Ramirez knows what to do." "What about her partner?" Castellano asked. "Chen's been working with her for 3 years. He might get suspicious if she just disappears. Chen's clean, but he's not smart enough to figure it out on his own. Besides, if he starts asking too many questions, we can handle him the same way." Mike felt sick as he listened to his former supervisor casually discussing Sarah's murder. But there was more. The conversation continued with details about the network's operations, including specific information about payoffs, protected drug shipments, and plans for eliminating other potential threats. "This is it," Rebecca said, pausing the recording. "This is the smoking gun. We have them discussing the murder of a police officer, along with all the evidence your partner collected about their corruption network. The FBI will definitely be interested in this." Mike nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something important. Sarah had been incredibly thorough in her investigation, but there were gaps in the timeline, periods where her surveillance had been interrupted or where key evidence seemed to be missing. "There's one more thing," Mike said, pulling out the last folder from Sarah's hidden cache. Sarah left notes about a bigger connection, something she called the Phoenix Operation. She believed the local corruption network was part of a larger interstate drug trafficking organization, with connections to cartels and organized crime families. Rebecca's eyes widened as she read through Sarah's notes. The Phoenix Operation appeared to be a sophisticated money laundering and drug distribution network that operated across multiple states, using corrupt law enforcement officials to protect their operations and eliminate threats. "If this is true," Rebecca said, "then your partner wasn't just investigating local corruption. She had stumbled onto one of the largest criminal conspiracies in the country. No wonder they were willing to kill her to keep it quiet." As they discussed their next steps, Mike noticed a man in a dark suit sitting at a table near the coffee shop's entrance. The man appeared to be reading a newspaper, but Mike caught him glancing in their direction several times. A chill ran down Mike's spine as he realized they might have been followed. "We need to leave," Mike said quietly, gathering up the evidence. "I think we might have company." Rebecca followed his gaze and immediately understood. She quickly shut down her laptop and helped Mike pack the documents back into the duffel bag. They left the coffee shop separately, with Rebecca heading toward her car while Mike walked in the opposite direction. Mike spent the next hour driving through the city, taking random turns and doubling back on his route to make sure he wasn't being followed. The man from the coffee shop was nowhere to be seen, but Mike couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Finally, he pulled into the parking garage of a downtown hotel and called Rebecca from a payphone in the lobby. "Did you see anyone following you?" he asked when she answered. "No, but I'm not taking any chances," she replied. "I'm going to contact my FBI source today and set up a meeting. Can you get the evidence to a safe location?" Mike had been thinking about that. He couldn't keep the evidence at his home or in his office. Both locations would be too easy for the corrupt officers to access. He needed somewhere secure, somewhere they wouldn't think to look. "I have an idea," he said. "There's a storage facility across town where my ex-wife keeps some of our old furniture. I still have access to the unit. I can hide the evidence there until we're ready to turn it over to the FBI." "Good," Rebecca said. "I'll contact you within 24 hours with details about the meeting. In the meantime, be careful. If they killed your partner to protect their operation, they won't hesitate to kill you too." After ending the call, Mike drove to the storage facility and carefully hidden Sarah's evidence in a locked box behind some old furniture. As he secured the storage unit, he couldn't help but think about Sarah and the courage it had taken for her to investigate such a dangerous conspiracy. She had known the risks, but she had pursued the truth anyway because she believed in justice. Now it was up to Mike to make sure her sacrifice hadn't been in vain. The next 24 hours were the longest of Mike's life. He went through the motions of his regular duties at the precinct, but every interaction with his colleagues felt loaded with suspicion. He found himself studying faces, listening to conversations with new ears, wondering who else might be part of the corruption network that Sarah had uncovered. Lieutenant Castellano had retired 5 years earlier, shortly after receiving a commendation for his years of service. Mike now understood that the timing hadn't been coincidental. With Sarah gone and the investigation into her disappearance cooling off, Castellano had probably decided it was safe to step away from active duty while maintaining his pension and reputation. But several of the other officers Sarah had identified were still working in the department, some in positions of significant authority. Detective Sergeant Maria Santos, who ran the drug interdiction unit. Captain James Morrison, who oversaw all major investigations. Even Deputy Chief Patricia Walsh, who was being considered for promotion to Chief of Police. Mike realized he had been walking through a minefield for years without knowing it. How many cases had been compromised? How many criminals had escaped justice because of corruption in the ranks? How many other officers like Sarah had gotten too close to the truth and paid the price? His phone buzzed with a text message from Rebecca. Meeting set for tomorrow, 2 p.m. Riverside Park, North Entrance. Come alone and watch for surveillance. Mike deleted the message immediately and spent the rest of the day planning his approach. He would need to call in sick to avoid suspicion about his absence from work. He would also need to make sure he wasn't followed to the meeting location. That evening, Mike sat in his apartment reviewing everything he knew about Sarah's investigation. The evidence she had gathered was comprehensive, but there were still questions that needed answers. What had happened to Carlos Ramirez, the drug dealer who had supposedly been part of the setup? Had he been eliminated to tie up loose ends, or was he still alive somewhere, potentially willing to testify? Mike also wondered about the scope of the Phoenix operation. If Sarah was right about the interstate connections, then the corruption network in their city was just one piece of a much larger criminal enterprise. Taking down the local players might not be enough to ensure justice. They would need to target the entire organization. The next morning, Mike called in sick and spent several hours driving around the city to make sure he wasn't being followed. At 1:30 p.m., he parked several blocks away from Riverside Park and walked to the north entrance, carrying a small backpack with copies of the most critical evidence from Sarah's cache. Rebecca was waiting on a bench near the entrance, feeding pigeons from a bag of breadcrumbs. She looked up as Mike approached and gestured for him to sit beside her. "My contact is Agent Jennifer Walsh with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit," Rebecca said quietly, continuing to scatter breadcrumbs. "She's worked on similar cases across the country and has a reputation for being thorough and discreet. She's agreed to meet with us, but she wants to see some of the evidence first to verify that this is worth pursuing." "How do we know we can trust her?" Mike asked, scanning the park for any signs of surveillance. "We don't, completely," Rebecca admitted. "But she comes highly recommended by sources I've worked with before. She's built her career on taking down corrupt cops, and she has the resources to investigate this properly." As they spoke, a woman in her 40s approached their bench. She was dressed casually in jeans and a windbreaker, but her posture and alert expression marked her as law enforcement. She had auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail and wore sunglasses despite the overcast day. "Rebecca Torres?" she asked, extending her hand. "Agent Walsh, thank you for meeting with us," Rebecca replied, standing up to shake hands. "This is Detective Chen, the officer I told you about." Agent Walsh studied Mike for a moment before sitting down on the bench beside them. "Before we go any further, I need to make something clear. If you're bringing me evidence of police corruption, I'm going to pursue it wherever it leads. That might include colleagues you consider friends, supervisors you respect, even people at the highest levels of your department. Are you prepared for that?" Mike nodded. "My partner died because of this corruption. I'm prepared to see justice done, no matter who gets hurt." "Good," Agent Walsh said. "Now show me what you've got." Mike opened his backpack and pulled out copies of some of Sarah's key evidence. The financial records showing payoffs to corrupt officers, photographs of clandestine meetings, and transcripts of the recorded conversations. He also included Sarah's handwritten notes explaining her investigation and the organizational chart she had created, mapping the corruption network. Mike closed the office door behind him and activated the recording device in his pocket. "I've got something that might interest you, Maria. Big time." He launched into his prepared story about the confidential informant and the supposed drug shipment, watching Santos's reaction carefully. She listened intently, asking the kinds of questions he would expect from an experienced detective. Details about the informant's reliability, the size of the shipment, the timeline for the operation. "This sounds like it could be huge," Santos said when Mike finished his briefing. "How reliable is your informant?" "He's been solid in the past," Mike replied, sticking to his script. "Gave us information that led to 3 successful busts over the last 2 years. Never steered us wrong." Santos nodded thoughtfully. Okay, here's what we'll do. I want to meet with your informant myself, verify the details. If everything checks out, we'll coordinate with the Port Authority and set up surveillance. This could be the kind of bust that gets us noticed at the federal level. Mike felt a moment of panic. He couldn't produce an actual informant, and any attempt to arrange a meeting would expose the operation as fake. Actually, there's a problem with that, he said, thinking quickly. The informant is scared. He thinks there might be a leak in the department. Someone tipping off the dealers. He'll only work through me. Santos's expression changed subtly, a flicker of something that might have been concern or suspicion. A leak? That's a serious accusation, Mike. Do you have any evidence to support that? Mike shrugged, trying to appear casual. Nothing concrete, just the informant's paranoia. You know how these guys get. They start imagining conspiracies everywhere. But he's been reliable before, so I'm willing to work with his conditions. I understand his concerns, Santos said slowly. But I can't authorize a major operation based solely on second-hand information. Tell you what, let me make some discreet inquiries about port security, see if there's been any unusual activity. In the meantime, you keep working your informant, try to get more specific details about the shipment. As Mike left Santos's office, he couldn't shake the feeling that something in her response had been off. She had asked the right questions and made the right responses, but there had been something in her eyes, a calculation that suggested she might be thinking about more than just police work. That evening, Mike met with Agent Walsh at a secure location to debrief about his encounter with Santos. She handled it exactly the way I would expect a corrupt officer to handle it, Agent Walsh said after reviewing the recording. Professional responses, appropriate questions, but she's buying time to verify the information and potentially warn. Her criminal contacts. What's our next move? Mike asked. We wait and watch, Agent Walsh replied. We have surveillance on Santos now, monitoring her communications and tracking her movements. If she's part of the network, she'll likely reach out to someone within the next 24 hours. Agent Walsh's prediction proved accurate. Within 18 hours of Mike's meeting with Santos, FBI surveillance detected several suspicious communications from her personal cell phone. The calls were brief and used coded language, but the timing and frequency suggested she was coordinating with criminal associates. Mike met with the FBI team again at their secure location, where Agent Kim had prepared a detailed analysis of Santos's activities. She made 4 calls yesterday evening, Agent Kim reported, pulling up phone records on his computer. All to numbers we've been monitoring as part of other investigations. 2 of the numbers belong to known associates of the Ramirez drug organization, the same group your partner was investigating when she disappeared. Mike felt a chill at the mention of the Ramirez organization. Carlos Ramirez had supposedly been the drug dealer Sarah was meant to arrest during her final undercover operation. If Santos was in contact with his associates, it confirmed that Sarah's suspicions about a setup had been correct. There's more, Agent Walsh added. After Santos made those calls, we detected increased activity at several locations we've been monitoring. It looks like they're preparing to move assets, probably in case your fake drug bust turns out to be real. Agent Rodriguez spread out surveillance photographs showing men loading boxes into trucks at a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. This warehouse has been on our radar for months. We believe it's one of their main distribution centers, but we haven't had enough evidence to get a search warrant. Until now, Agent Walsh said with satisfaction. Santos's response to your information gives us probable cause to believe the location is being used for drug trafficking. We're going to raid it tonight. Mike realized the implications. If you raid the warehouse, Santos will know that something went wrong with her warning system. She'll figure out that the drug shipment information was fake. That's the point, Agent Walsh explained. We want to force their hand, make them think their network has been compromised. When criminals panic, they make mistakes. They start communicating more openly, moving assets carelessly, eliminating potential witnesses. That's when we can gather the evidence we need to bring down the entire operation. As the FBI team prepared for the warehouse raid, Mike returned to the precinct to maintain his normal routine. But the building felt different now that he knew Santos was corrupt. Every interaction with his colleagues carried new weight. Every conversation could potentially be overheard by someone working for the criminal network. That afternoon, Santos approached Mike at his desk. She looked agitated, her usual professional demeanor cracked by stress. "Mike, we need to talk," she said quietly. Privately, Mike followed her to an empty conference room, activating his recording device as they sat down across from each other. "There's a problem with your drug bust information," Santos began, glancing around nervously despite the closed door. "I made some inquiries like I said I would, and I'm hearing things that don't add up." "What kind of things?" Mike asked, trying to maintain an innocent expression. "Port security hasn't detected any unusual activity. Customs hasn't flagged any suspicious shipments. And I've got sources in the drug community who haven't heard anything about a major shipment coming through." Mike felt sweat beading on his forehead. Santos was more connected than the FBI had realized if she had been able to verify the lack of a drug shipment so quickly. "Maybe the dealers are being more careful than usual," Mike suggested. "Or maybe my informant got some bad information." Santos studied his face intently. "Mike, I've been doing this for 15 years. I know when something doesn't feel right. Your informant's story has holes in it, and your behavior has been different lately." Mike's heart began racing. Had he blown his cover? Was Santos about to expose him as an FBI informant? "Different how?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Distracted, secretive, like you're working on something you can't talk about." Santos leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Is Internal Affairs investigating my unit?" The question caught Mike off guard. Santos wasn't suspicious about him being an FBI informant. She was worried about an Internal Affairs investigation into her own corruption. "Not that I know of," Mike replied truthfully. "Why would you think that?" "Because 3 of my best busts from last year are being reviewed by Downtown. Cases I worked personally, cases where the evidence was solid. Someone's looking for problems where there aren't any." Mike realized he was getting an unexpected glimpse into how the corruption network operated. Santos genuinely believed her activities were justified, that she was protecting good criminals from bad ones, maintaining some kind of balance in the drug trade while building her arrest statistics. "Maria, if there's something you need to tell me, something you're worried about, I'm here to listen," Mike said, hoping to encourage her to reveal more. Santos was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with some internal conflict. Finally, she spoke. "There are things about this job, about how the drug trade really works, that they don't teach you at the academy. Sometimes you have to make compromises, work with people you might not normally work with, to achieve the greater good." "What kind of compromises?" Mike pressed gently. Before Santos could answer, her phone buzzed with an urgent text message. As she read it, her face went pale. "I have to go," she said abruptly, standing up and heading for the door. "Family emergency." Mike watched her leave, knowing that the family emergency was probably news about the FBI raid on the warehouse. The trap was closing around the corruption network, and Santos was about to find out just how compromised her operation had become. The FBI raid on the warehouse yielded spectacular results. Agents found over 200 kilograms of cocaine, along with sophisticated packaging and distribution equipment, financial records, and communication devices that provided direct links to the corruption network Sarah had been investigating. Mike met with Agent Walsh the next morning to review the evidence recovered from the raid. "We hit the jackpot," Agent Walsh said, spreading photographs across the conference table. "Not only did we find drugs and equipment, but we also found detailed records of payoffs to corrupt officers. Your friend Santos has been receiving monthly payments of $10,000 for the past 3 years. The financial records also revealed the scope of the operation's protection network. Judges, prosecutors, city officials, and police officers at every level had been receiving payments in exchange for favorable treatment of the organization's activities. But the most important discovery," Agent Rodriguez added, pulling up a computer file, "was this encrypted hard drive. It contains communications going back 5 years including discussions about eliminating threats to the operation. Mike's breath caught as Agent Rodriguez opened a file containing email exchanges between network members. The messages used coded a language, but their meaning was clear enough. One exchange from 11 years earlier made Mike's blood run cold. The Martinez problem is escalating. She's connected too many dots. Recommend permanent solution during scheduled operation. Approved. Make it look like operational casualty. Ramirez will handle disposal. What about Chen? He might ask questions. Chen is not a threat. Martinez kept him isolated from sensitive information. If he becomes problematic later, address then. Mike stared at the screen, reading his own death warrant written in cold, clinical language. These people had murdered his partner and then calmly discussed whether they needed to kill him too. There's more, Agent Walsh said gently, recognizing the pain in Mike's expression. We found references to other officers who were eliminated for getting too close to the truth. Your partner wasn't their first victim. Over the next hour, Agent Walsh walked Mike through a timeline of suspicious deaths and disappearances going back nearly 20 years. Officers who had died in accidents, witnesses who had committed suicide, informants who had simply vanished. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. How many people did they kill? Mike asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy. We're still investigating, but we estimate at least 15 deaths directly attributable to this network. Probably more that we haven't identified yet. Mike felt a mixture of rage and grief as he absorbed the magnitude of the crimes. Sarah hadn't just been investigating corruption. She had been fighting a criminal organization that had turned law enforcement into an instrument of murder. What happens now? He asked. Now we spring the larger trap, Agent Walsh replied. The warehouse raid has panicked the network. They're making mistakes, communicating more openly, trying to protect their assets. We're going to use that panic to identify all the players and gather evidence for a comprehensive prosecution. Agent Kim pulled up surveillance footage from outside the precinct, showing Santos arriving for work that morning. She looked haggard and nervous, constantly checking her phone and looking over her shoulder. She knows something big has happened, Agent Kim observed. We expect her to reach out to her handlers soon, probably to ask for instructions or request protection. As, if on cue, Mike's phone rang. It was Santos, and she sounded panicked. Mike, I need to see you right away. Something's happened. Something big. Can you meet me at Riverside Diner in 20 minutes? Mike looked at Agent Walsh, who nodded and gestured to the surveillance team. I'll be there, Mike told Santos. Come. Alone, Santos added before hanging up. Agent Walsh and her team quickly prepared Mike for what could be a dangerous encounter. If Santos suspected he was working with the FBI, she might be setting up an ambush. But if she was genuinely panicked and looking for help, this could be their chance to flip her into cooperation. Remember, Agent Walsh cautioned, Santos is probably armed and definitely desperate. If she figures out you're wearing a wire, she might try to eliminate you to protect herself. Mike drove to the diner with an FBI surveillance team following, at a distance. Riverside Diner was a rundown establishment in an industrial part of town, the kind of place where people went to have conversations they didn't want overheard. Santos was already there when Mike arrived, sitting in a corner booth, with her back to the wall and a clear view of the entrance. She looked terrible, dark circles under her eyes, hands shaking as she sipped coffee from a cracked mug. Thanks for coming, she said, as Mike slid into the booth across from her. I didn't know who else I could trust. What's going on, Maria? Mike asked, activating his recording device. Santos glanced around the nearly empty diner before leaning forward and speaking in a low voice. The warehouse on Industrial Boulevard got hit by the FBI last night. Major bust. Drugs, money, equipment, everything. The people I work with, they think there's been a leak in their organization. Mike tried to look surprised. What warehouse? What people? Santos stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide how much to reveal. Mike, I'm going to tell you something that could get us both killed. For the past 3 years, I've been providing protection for a drug operation, in exchange for money. I told myself it was for the greater good. They were targeting the violent dealers, the ones who sold to kids, while protecting the more civilized operators. Mike remained silent, letting her continue. But it's gotten out of hand. They've asked me to do things, provide information about other officers, manipulate evidence in ways that go beyond what I signed up for. And now, with this warehouse bust, they're talking about eliminating potential witnesses. What kind of witnesses? Mike asked, though he already suspected the answer. Other cops who might know too much, informants who could testify against them, people like… Santos paused, struggling with the words. People like Sarah Martinez. Mike felt his heart stop. What do you mean? Santos's eyes filled with tears. Sarah was getting close to exposing the whole operation 11 years ago. She had been investigating cases that they had manipulated. The undercover operation that got her killed wasn't what it seemed. It was a setup designed to eliminate her. You knew about this? Mike asked, struggling to keep his voice level. Not at the time, Santos said quickly. I only found out later, after I had gotten deeper into the organization. By then, it was too late to come forward without implicating myself. Mike leaned back in the booth, processing what Santos had just admitted. She had known about Sarah's murder for years and had said nothing. Worse, she had continued to work with the people responsible. Maria, you need to come forward now, Mike said. Help us bring these people to justice. Santos shook her head. You don't understand. This isn't just about corrupt cops taking bribes. This is about a criminal organization that has infiltrated every level of law enforcement. They have judges, prosecutors, federal agents, people who could make evidence disappear or ensure that witnesses never make it to trial. Federal agents? Mike asked, feeling a chill. At least 2 that I know of. One in the DEA, one in the FBI. That's how they've stayed ahead of investigations for so long. They have people on the inside of every agency that might threaten them. Mike realized the implications immediately. If there were corrupt FBI agents involved in the network, then Agent Walsh and her team might be walking into a trap. Or worse, Agent Walsh herself might be compromised. I have to go, Mike said, standing up abruptly. Wait, Santos called after him. Mike, if you're thinking about going to the authorities with this, be very careful who you trust. The network has people everywhere, and they won't hesitate to kill anyone who threatens them. Mike left the diner with his mind racing. Everything. He thought he knew about the investigation had just been called into question. If Santos was telling the truth about FBI corruption, then his partnership with Agent Walsh might have been compromised from the beginning. But as he drove away from the diner, Mike noticed something in his rearview mirror that made his blood run cold. The same dark sedan that had been following him intermittently for days was back, maintaining a steady distance behind his car. Either the FBI surveillance team was being unusually obvious, or someone else had been tracking his movements. Given what Santos had just revealed about the network's infiltration of federal agencies, Mike couldn't be sure which possibility was worse. Mike spent the next several hours driving through the city, taking random turns and making unexpected stops to determine whether he was being followed. The dark sedan stayed with him through multiple route changes, confirming his worst fears. Someone was tracking his movements, and it wasn't part of the FBI's protective surveillance. As evening approached, Mike made a decision that went against every instinct he had developed as a police officer. Instead of contacting Agent Walsh or the FBI team, he drove to an electronics store and purchased a prepaid cell phone with cash. If there were corrupt federal agents involved in the network, he couldn't risk using any communication methods they might be monitoring. From the parking lot of a 24-hour grocery store, Mike called Rebecca Torres, the investigative journalist, who had helped him initiate the FBI investigation. Mike? Rebecca answered, sounding surprised. I thought you were working with the FBI now. Is everything okay? I need to meet with you, Mike said, scanning the parking lot for signs of surveillance. Tonight. Somewhere public but not obvious. And Rebecca, don't tell anyone you're meeting me. They agreed to meet at a large bookstore in a busy shopping mall, a location with multiple entrances and exits where they could blend into the crowd. Mike arrived first and positioned himself in the coffee shop area where he could watch for both Rebecca and potential surveillance. Rebecca arrived 20 minutes later, looking concerned and carrying a laptop bag. She found Mike at a corner table and sat down across from him. "You look terrible," she said without preamble. "What's happened?" Mike quickly briefed her on his undercover work with the FBI, the warehouse raid, and his conversation with Santos at the diner. Rebecca listened intently, taking notes on her laptop and asking clarifying questions. "So Santos claims there are corrupt FBI agents involved in the network?" Rebecca asked when Mike finished his account. "At least 2, according to her. One in the DEA, one in the FBI. If that's true, then Agent Walsh and her team might be compromised." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. "There's another possibility you should consider, Mike. What if Santos is lying? What if she's trying to undermine your trust in the FBI to protect the network?" Mike had been thinking the same thing. "But the surveillance I've been noticing suggests someone is tracking me outside of the official FBI operation. If Agent Walsh's team was following me, why would they be so obvious about it?" "Unless they want you to notice," Rebecca suggested. "Maybe they're trying to make you paranoid, get you to do something that exposes you as a threat to the network." The conversation was interrupted by Mike's new prepaid phone ringing. The number was blocked, but Mike answered cautiously. "Detective Chen," a distorted voice said, clearly using electronic voice modification. "You've been asking questions about things that don't concern you." Mike's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" "Someone who knows what happened to Sarah Martinez. Someone who knows what will happen to you if you don't stop digging into the past. If you know what happened to Sarah, then tell me," Mike said, gesturing frantically to Rebecca to start recording on her laptop. "Sarah Martinez died because she couldn't leave well enough alone. She thought she was fighting corruption, but she was actually interfering with a carefully balanced system that keeps this city from descending into chaos." "Balanced system?" Mike repeated, trying to keep the caller talking. "You mean the drug trafficking and murder? I mean the management of criminal activity in ways that minimize harm to civilians. The network your partner was investigating doesn't just protect drug dealers, it controls them. It decides who operates where, what products are sold, how violence is contained." Mike realized he was talking to someone high up in the conspiracy, someone who genuinely believed that their criminal organization was providing a public service. "And when people like Sarah threaten that balance," Mike asked, "they have to be removed, just like you'll be removed if you continue to interfere." The line went dead. Mike and Rebecca sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing what they had just heard. "Did you get that recorded?" Mike asked. Rebecca nodded, replaying the conversation on her laptop. "This changes everything. Whoever called you isn't just admitting to Sarah's murder. They're describing a criminal organization that believes it's performing a legitimate government function." Mike realized they were dealing with something far more sophisticated than simple police corruption. The network wasn't just about officers taking bribes. It was about a shadow system of criminal justice that operated parallel to the official legal system. "We need to be very careful about who we share this with," Mike said. "If there really are corrupt federal agents involved, then going through official channels could get us killed," Rebecca agreed. "I think we need to develop an independent verification system. I have contacts at other newspapers, television stations, and federal agencies outside of the immediate area. We can use them to verify the reliability of our FBI contacts." As they prepared to leave the bookstore, Mike noticed 2 men in dark suits near the main entrance who seemed to be watching the coffee shop area. They were trying to look casual, but their positioning and attention patterns marked them as surveillance operatives. "We're being watched," Mike told Rebecca quietly. 2 men by the main entrance. Rebecca glanced in that direction without making it obvious. "I see them. There's also a woman by the magazine rack who's been there too long to be actually shopping." They were surrounded. Mike quickly scanned the bookstore layout, looking for alternative exits. The store had a back entrance near the employee break area, but reaching it would require walking past several potential surveillance positions. "Follow my lead," Mike whispered to Rebecca. "Act natural, but be ready to run." They stood up and, began walking toward the mystery section of the bookstore, using the tall shelves as cover while they made their way toward the back of the store. Mike noticed that the surveillance team was repositioning to maintain visual contact, confirming that they were the targets. As they reached the back corner of the store, Mike spotted an emergency exit that appeared to be alarmed but not actively monitored. He grabbed Rebecca's hand and pulled her toward the exit. "This will set off an alarm," he warned her. "Better an alarm than whatever those people have planned for us," Rebecca replied. Mike pushed open the emergency door, immediately, triggering a loud alarm that echoed through the store. They found themselves in a loading dock area behind the building, with several delivery trucks and employee vehicles parked nearby. "My car is in the front parking lot," Rebecca said as they ran toward the street. "Forget your car," Mike replied. "They'll be watching it." They reached the street just as security guards and store employees began responding to the alarm. In the confusion, Mike flagged down a taxi and he and Rebecca climbed in. "Airport," Mike told the driver. Though he had no intention of going there, after several blocks, he changed the destination to a downtown hotel. As the taxi wound through evening traffic, Mike noticed that they were still being followed by at least 2 vehicles. The network's surveillance capabilities were more extensive than he had realized. "Rebecca, I think we need to assume that everyone we've been in contact with is compromised," Mike said. "Agent Walsh, the FBI team, possibly even your editor and contacts." Rebecca nodded grimly. "So what do we do? We have evidence of a massive criminal conspiracy, but no one we can trust to present it to." Mike had been thinking about that problem since receiving the threatening phone call. There was only one approach that might work: going public with the evidence before the network could stop them. "How quickly can you put together a comprehensive story for publication?" he asked. "With everything we have? 2 or 3 days if I work around the clock. But Mike, if we publish this story without law enforcement backup, we'll be completely exposed. The network will know exactly who's threatening them and where to find us." "Then we better make sure the story is so complete and so well documented that killing us won't stop the investigation," Mike replied. As their taxi pulled up to the downtown hotel, Mike realized they were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Once Rebecca's story was published, the network would have no choice but to eliminate them to protect their operation. But Sarah had died trying to expose this conspiracy, and Mike owed it to her memory to see it through to the end, whatever the cost. Mike and Rebecca checked into the downtown hotel using false names and cash, taking adjoining rooms on the 4th floor with a view of the street that would allow them to monitor for surveillance. Mike had learned enough about operational security during his years as a detective to know they needed to assume their every move was being tracked. In Rebecca's room, they spread out all of Sarah's evidence, along with the new information they had gathered from the FBI investigation. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Financial records showing millions of dollars in bribes, recorded conversations documenting murders and cover-ups, and organizational charts mapping a criminal network that extended across multiple states. "I need to verify some of these financial records," Rebecca said, opening her laptop. "I have sources at several banks who can confirm whether these account numbers and transactions are legitimate." While Rebecca worked her contacts, Mike studied the personnel files Sarah had compiled on corrupt officers. Many of the names were familiar. Colleagues he had worked with for years, people he had trusted and respected. The betrayal went deeper than he had imagined. One file caught his attention. Detective Lieutenant Patricia Walsh, currently Deputy Chief of Police and candidate for chief. According to Sarah's notes, Walsh had been receiving payments from the network for over a decade, using her position to manipulate investigations and protect criminal operations. Mike's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. Agent Jennifer Walsh of the FBI Public Corruption Unit shared the same last name. Was it a coincidence? Or were they dealing with a family connection that explained how the network had infiltrated federal law enforcement? "Rebecca," Mike said, showing her the file. "Look at this name. Lieutenant Patricia Walsh in the police department, Agent Jennifer Walsh in the FBI. Are they related?" Rebecca stopped typing and examined the documents. "That's a good catch. Let me do some research." Over the next hour, Rebecca used her investigative skills to trace the connection between the two Walsh women. What she found confirmed Mike's worst fears. "They're sisters," Rebecca announced. Patricia Walsh, the corrupt police lieutenant, is the older sister of Jennifer Walsh, the FBI agent who's been running your undercover operation. Mike felt sick as the pieces fell into place. Agent Walsh hadn't been investigating the corruption network. She had been managing it, using Mike to identify threats and gather intelligence on anyone who might expose the conspiracy. That explains how they knew about Sarah's investigation, Mike realized. Patricia Walsh would have had access to internal police communications, and Jennifer Walsh could have monitored federal investigations. They could coordinate between local and federal law enforcement to protect their operations. Rebecca was already pulling up more information on her laptop. "It gets worse. I'm finding evidence that Jennifer Walsh has been involved in several suspicious cases over the past 5 years. Investigations that were shut down prematurely, evidence that disappeared, witnesses who died before they could testify." As they absorbed this revelation, Mike's prepaid phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Agent Walsh's number. "Detective Chen," Agent Walsh's familiar voice said when Mike answered. "We need to meet immediately. There's been a development in the case that requires your immediate attention." Mike looked at Rebecca, who was shaking her head vigorously. "What kind of development?" Mike asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "I can't discuss it over the phone. Meet me at the same location where we first met. Riverside Park, North Entrance. Come alone and bring all of the evidence your partner collected." "When?" Mike asked, though he had no intention of keeping the appointment. "Now. This can't wait, Mike. People's lives are at stake." Agent Walsh hung up before Mike could respond. "She wants to meet at the park where we first made contact," Mike told Rebecca. "She wants me to bring all of Sarah's evidence." "It's a trap," Rebecca said immediately. "They know you figured out their game, and now they want to eliminate you and recover the evidence before you can expose them." Mike agreed, but he also realized they might be able to turn the situation to their advantage. What if we give them what they want, but not in the way they expect? He outlined a plan that would require significant risk, but might provide the final evidence they needed to expose the entire network. Rebecca would continue working on her story, while Mike went to the meeting with Agent Walsh. But instead of bringing the real evidence, he would bring copies while the originals remained, safely hidden. "This is incredibly dangerous," Rebecca warned. "If they realize you're trying to trick them, they'll kill you on the spot." "They're probably planning to kill me anyway," Mike replied. "At least this way, we might get them to admit their crimes. On record." Mike activated the recording device the FBI had given him, hoping it would continue to function, even though Agent Walsh had probably been monitoring its use all along. He also took Rebecca's backup recording device as insurance. As he prepared to leave for the meeting, Rebecca grabbed his arm. "Mike, if something happens to you, I promise I'll finish what Sarah started. The story will be published, and these people will be exposed." Mike nodded, appreciating her commitment, but hoping it wouldn't come to that. He left the hotel through a service entrance and made his way to Riverside Park, constantly checking for surveillance, but knowing that the network probably already knew his location. The park was nearly empty as evening approached, with only a few joggers and dog walkers visible on the distant paths. Mike spotted Agent Walsh sitting on the same bench where they had first met, but this time she wasn't alone. 2 men in dark suits stood at strategic positions around the park, obviously providing security. As Mike approached the bench, Agent Walsh stood up and smiled, but there was something cold and predatory in her expression that he had never noticed before. "Mike, thank you for coming so quickly," she said. "Do you have the evidence?" Mike held up a duffel bag containing the copied documents. "Everything's here, but before I hand it over, I want to know what's really going on. I think I deserve the truth after everything I've been through." Agent Walsh's smile faltered slightly. "The truth is that you've been extremely helpful in our investigation. More helpful than you realize." "Investigation into what?" Mike pressed. "Police corruption or managing it?" For a moment, Agent Walsh's professional mask slipped completely, revealing the calculating criminal underneath. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," she said. How long have you known? Long enough, Mike replied, making sure his recording devices were capturing every word. Long enough to understand that you and your sister have been running this network for years. Long enough to know that you killed Sarah Martinez to protect your operation. Agent Walsh gestured almost imperceptibly, and Mike heard footsteps approaching from behind. The two men in suits were moving in to surround him. Sarah Martinez was an idealistic fool who thought she could single-handedly reform law enforcement, Agent Walsh said, her voice taking on a lecturing tone. She never understood that some level of corruption is necessary to maintain order. Without our network managing criminal activity, this city would be torn apart by gang wars and drug violence. So you appointed yourselves judge, jury, and executioner? Mike asked, backing away as the two men got closer. We appointed ourselves administrators of a system that actually works, Agent Walsh replied. We decide which criminals get arrested and which ones get protected. We control the flow of drugs to minimize violence. We eliminate threats to public safety, whether they come from the criminal world or from law enforcement itself. Mike realized he was listening to the confession he needed, but he was running out of time and space. The two men were now close enough to grab him, and Agent Walsh was reaching into her jacket for what was probably a weapon. The only mistake we made, Agent Walsh continued, was underestimating your partner's investigative abilities. And now, we're making the same mistake with you. Mike made a desperate decision. Instead of trying to fight the two men approaching him, he threw the duffel bag toward the lake and ran in the opposite direction, hoping to draw their attention away from the evidence while giving himself a chance to escape. The strategy worked, partially. One of the men chased after the bag while the other pursued Mike. But Agent Walsh was already pulling out her service weapon, and Mike realized he wasn't going to outrun a bullet. Just as Agent Walsh raised her gun, the sound of police sirens filled the air. Multiple patrol cars were converging on the park from different directions, their lights flashing and sirens wailing. Agent Walsh hesitated, clearly confused by the unexpected arrival of law enforcement. In that moment of hesitation, Mike tackled her, knocking the gun from her hand and pinning her to the ground. Detective Chen, this is unnecessary, Agent Walsh said, still trying to maintain her authority even while being restrained. You're interfering with a federal investigation. No, Mike replied, breathing heavily from exertion and adrenaline. I'm ending one. The police cars surrounding the park weren't part of Agent Walsh's corrupt network. They were officers from a neighboring jurisdiction that Rebecca had contacted using information from Mike's original investigation. She had realized that local law enforcement couldn't be trusted, but she had found clean cops in the county sheriff's department who were willing to intervene. As Agent Walsh and her two associates were taken into custody, Mike retrieved the duffel bag from the lake. The documents inside were soaked but still readable, providing additional evidence of the network's criminal activities. Detective Captain Maria Santos arrived at the scene just as Agent Walsh was being loaded into a patrol car. She approached, Mike with her hands visible and a resigned expression on her face. I'm ready to make a deal, she said. Full cooperation in exchange for protection from the network. Mike studied her face, seeing genuine fear alongside the resignation. What can you offer? Names, dates, financial records, everything. I've been keeping my own insurance policy for years, documentation of every crime the network committed. I was too scared to come forward before, but after tonight, I know they'll try to eliminate me anyway. Over the next several hours, as law enforcement from multiple jurisdictions descended on the scene. The full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. Santos provided detailed information about the network's operations, confirming many of Sarah's suspicions and revealing new aspects of the criminal organization. The Phoenix operation, as Sarah had called it, was even more extensive than originally believed. It involved drug trafficking, money laundering, human trafficking, and systematic corruption across 6 states. The network had been responsible for dozens of murders over the past 2 decades, including law enforcement officers, witnesses, informants, and anyone else who threatened their operations. Rebecca Torres, meanwhile, had been working frantically to publish her story before the network could suppress it. Using contacts at newspapers across the country, She had prepared a comprehensive exposé that would be published simultaneously in multiple outlets, making it impossible for the criminals to contain the damage. As dawn broke over the city, Rebecca's story hit the newsstands and websites. Shadow Network: How Corrupt Federal Agents and Police Officers Built a Criminal Empire. The story included Sarah's evidence, Mike's undercover recordings, Santos's testimony, and documentation of the network's extensive criminal activities. Within hours, it had sparked a national scandal that would lead to one of the largest law enforcement corruption investigations in American history. Mike sat in a secure location, reading Rebecca's story on his phone and thinking about Sarah. She had died trying to expose this conspiracy, but her evidence had finally brought it to light. Justice had been delayed by 11 years, but it had finally arrived. 6 months after the arrests at Riverside Park, Mike found himself testifying before a federal grand jury in what had become the largest police corruption case in the country's history. The courtroom was packed with journalists, federal prosecutors, and family members of the network's victims. Agent Jennifer Walsh sat at the defendant's table alongside her sister Patricia and 14 other co-conspirators. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Sarah's meticulously documented investigation, combined with Santos's insider testimony and the recordings Mike had made during his undercover work, painted a complete picture of their criminal enterprise. Detective Chen, the federal prosecutor asked, "Can you tell the jury about the last conversation you had with Detective Sarah Martinez before her disappearance?" Mike had told this story dozens of times to investigators, but it never got easier. He described Sarah's intuition about patterns in their cases, her concerns about the Moretti investigation, and most importantly, her final words to him: "Promise me something, Mike. If I don't come back, don't let them close this case." "And did you keep that promise?" the prosecutor asked. "It took me 11 years, Mike replied, looking directly at the defendants. "But yes, I kept that promise." The trial revealed the full scope of the Phoenix operation's crimes. Financial experts testified about the money laundering network that had processed over $500 million in drug profits. Forensic accountants documented bribes totaling millions of dollars paid to corrupt officials. Former victims and their families testified about the violence and intimidation they had suffered. But it was Detective Maria Santos's testimony that provided the most damaging evidence against the network. Over 3 days on the witness stand, she detailed her own involvement in the conspiracy while describing the systematic corruption that had infected law enforcement at every level. The network didn't just protect drug dealers, Santos testified. They controlled the entire criminal justice system in multiple cities. They decided which cases got prosecuted, which evidence got suppressed, and which people lived or died. When asked about Sarah Martinez's investigation, Santos broke down in tears. "Detective Martinez was the most honest cop I ever worked with," she said. "She died because she believed in justice, and we killed her to protect our crimes. I've lived with that guilt for 11 years, and I'll live with it for the rest of my life." The defense attorneys tried to argue that their clients had been providing a valuable service by managing criminal activity and preventing gang wars. But the prosecution's evidence was too comprehensive, and the jury too appalled by the scope of the conspiracy, for those arguments to carry any weight. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts against all defendants. Agent Jennifer Walsh was sentenced to life in prison without parole for her role in orchestrating Sarah's murder and numerous other killings. Her sister Patricia received a sentence of 40 years for her part in the conspiracy. Detective Maria Santos, in exchange for her cooperation, received a reduced sentence of 15 years in federal prison. She would serve her time in protective custody, as former corrupt cops rarely survived long in general population. 2 years after the trials ended, Mike stood in a cemetery on a crisp October morning, placing fresh flowers on Sarah Martinez's grave. The headstone had been updated with new inscription: "Detective Sarah Martinez. She died fighting for justice, and justice prevailed." The aftermath of the Phoenix operation investigation had led to reforms throughout law enforcement. New oversight, procedures, Enhanced whistleblower protections and regular corruption audits had been implemented in police departments nationwide. Sarah's sacrifice had ultimately made the entire system more honest and accountable. Mike had retired from the police department and now worked as a consultant, helping other jurisdictions identify and investigate corruption within their ranks. He carried Sarah's badge in his wallet as a reminder of the price of justice and the importance of never giving up the fight against those who would abuse their authority. Rebecca Torres had won a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on the Phoenix operation. She continued to investigate corruption and government malfeasance, inspired by Sarah's example of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The warehouse where Sarah had disappeared had been converted into a community center that provided services to families affected by drug violence. A plaque near the entrance read, "Dedicated to the memory of all those who died fighting to make our communities safer." As Mike walked away from Sarah's grave, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for over a decade. His partner's final case was closed, her killers were behind bars, and her legacy lived on in the reforms that would protect future generations of honest cops from the corruption that had cost her life. Sarah Martinez had kept her promise to serve and protect, even unto death. And Mike Chen had kept his promise to her. He had never let them close the case, and justice had finally been served. The truth about Detective Sarah Martinez's disappearance was no longer a mystery. Her courage, her integrity, and her ultimate sacrifice had exposed one of the largest criminal conspiracies in American law enforcement history. She had died fighting corruption, but in the end, she had won. Mike pulled out his phone and looked at a photo he carried of Sarah from their graduation day at the police academy. They had been so young then, so idealistic, so certain that they could make a difference in the world. Sarah had made that difference, even though it had cost her everything. As Mike drove away from the cemetery, he thought about the other cases on his desk, the other corrupt networks that might be operating in cities across the country. Sarah's investigation was complete, but the fight for justice would continue. And wherever that fight led him, Mike would carry Sarah's memory with him, along with the knowledge that even the most powerful criminal conspiracies could be brought down by the courage of one honest cop who refused to look the other way. The Phoenix operation was dead, its network dismantled, its leaders imprisoned. But Sarah Martinez's legacy would live on in every honest cop who chose to stand up against corruption, no matter the personal cost. Justice had been served. The case was finally closed.